Hello and welcome to Stat 200. I'm Dr. Zimmerman. I coordinate many of the instructional materials that are used across all online sections of the course. For each lesson, there will be a full video lecture such as this one. These videos do tend to be long, so I recommend that you take breaks while watching them. If you're watching the lecture videos in YouTube, there will be timestamps in the video's description that will let you fast forward if there's a specific topic that you're looking for. The lecture videos cover the same content and learning objectives as the online notes. Some students choose to watch these videos instead of reading the online notes. In that case, you would still need to read the textbook. Many students also choose to read both the online notes and watch the videos. Each video will start with a list of learning objectives that will be covered. These are all of the learning objectives listed for Lesson 1. Most lessons do not have this many learning objectives. Lesson 1 is different from most of the later lessons in that it focuses more on vocabulary. This week, you'll be introduced to terminology that will be used throughout the course. Many students find that it is helpful to create flashcards for this lesson in particular. Lesson 1 is also different from the rest in that there are no calculations this week. Let's get started with the first learning objective here. Our first learning objective is to identify cases and variables in a research study. Here we have two new vocabulary words, case and variable. In the online notes, vocabulary terms will have this book icon. When conducting a research study, we collect data from cases, which are sometimes known as units or experimental units. These are the individuals from which the data are collected. A variable is a characteristic of cases that can take on different values. In other words, something that can vary. This is in contrast to a constant, which is the same for all cases in a study. Let's work through one example. Researchers want to know if men and women differ in terms of how much coffee they consume. The cases here are the individuals participating in the study. There are two variables. The first is gender. The second is coffee consumption. The second learning objective is to classify variables as categorical or quantitative. Variables can be classified as categorical or quantitative. Categorical variables are those that provide groupings that may have no logical order or a logical order with inconsistent differences between groups. For example, rankings. The difference between first place and second place is not always equal to the difference between third place and fourth place. Quantitative variables have numerical values with consistent intervals. Quantitative variables may be continuous or discrete. Continuous variables can take on any value and any value between two values. In other words, a value that could go out to an infinite number of decimal places. Discrete variables can take on a limited number of values. For example, only whole numbers. Let's look at some examples. This is the same scenario that we looked at in the first learning objective. Researchers want to know if men and women differ in terms of how much coffee they consume. We said that there were two variables here, gender and coffee consumption. We're given that gender is being measured in terms of men and women, so this is a categorical variable. We need more information about the second variable of coffee consumption in order to determine if it's categorical or quantitative. If we're given that coffee consumption is measured in cups per week, for example, I probably drink around 7 cups of coffee in a week, this is a quantitative variable because it's being measured as a numeric value with consistent intervals. Assume that participants can say that they can drink any amount of coffee, for example, 2.5 cups or 3.33333 cups. This is a continuous variable. Let's look at one more example. Is there a relationship between a college volleyball team's national ranking and their head coach's salary? We have two variables again, the team's national ranking and their head coach's salary. While national ranking is going to take on a numeric value, for example, first, second, third, those values will not have consistent differences. Again, the difference between the first and second ranked teams is not necessarily the same as the difference between the third and the fourth ranked teams or the fifth and the sixth ranked teams. This is a categorical variable. The second variable of head coach's salary is going to be a numerical value. It will have equal intervals, so this is a quantitative variable. Our third learning objective this week is to identify explanatory and response variables in a research study. In some research studies, one variable is used to predict or explain differences in another variable. In those cases, the explanatory variable is used to predict or explain differences in the response variable. The explanatory variable is also known as the independent variable or predictor variable. If you're graphing the data, this would go on the x-axis, which is the horizontal axis. The response variable is also known as the dependent variable or outcome variable. If you're graphing the data, this would go on the y-axis, which is the vertical axis. Later in this lesson, we'll learn about experimental research studies. In experiments, the explanatory variable is the variable that's being manipulated by the researchers. Let's look at some examples. Researchers want to know if men and women differ in terms of how much coffee they consume. Here, they want to use gender to explain differences in coffee consumption. Gender is the explanatory variable, and coffee consumption is the response variable. We'll see one more example. Is there a relationship between a college volleyball team's national ranking and their head coach's salary? Here, we're looking for a relationship between these two variables. We're not given a direction, so we're not using one variable to predict the other. In this case, there is no explanatory or response variables. The fourth learning objective is to distinguish between a sample and a population. We often have questions concerning large populations. The population includes every case that we're interested in making a conclusion about. Gathering information from the entire population is not always possible due to barriers such as time, accessibility, and cost. Instead of gathering information from the whole population, we often gather information from a smaller subset of the population, known as the sample. Values concerning a sample are referred to as sample statistics. Values concerning a population are referred to as population parameters. Starting in Lesson 4, we'll be studying inferential statistics. These are statistical procedures that use data from an observed sample to make a conclusion about a population. For example, let's say that all of these people represent our population. Maybe we don't have the resources to survey all of these people. What we would do in that case is collect data from a subset of the population. Using sampling methods, we select the cases from the population that will participate in our research study. That group of cases is known as the sample. The goal of inferential statistics, then, is to use data from the sample to make a conclusion or an inference about the larger population. The first 3 lessons of the course focus on descriptive statistics, so describing data. Starting in Lesson 4, we'll be working with inferential procedures. In order to use those procedures, we need to know if our sample is representative of the population. This transitions nicely to our next learning objective. Determine whether a given sample is representative of the intended population. A sample is representative if it accurately reflects the population. For example, the characteristics of the sample should match up to the characteristics of the population. If this is not true, then we say that the sample may be biased. Bias is systematic favoring of certain outcomes. The first type of bias that we're going to talk about is sampling bias. This is systematic favoring of certain outcomes due to the methods employed to obtain the sample. We can avoid sampling bias by using probability-based sampling methods. There are many different probability-based sampling methods. We're only going to cover one probability-based method in this course, and that is simple random sampling. Our sixth learning objective is to identify simple random sampling and convenient sampling methods. Simple random sampling is a method of obtaining a sample from a population in which every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. We'll be comparing this to convenient sampling, which is a method of obtaining a sample from a population by ease of accessibility. A convenient sample is not random and may not be representative of the intended population. When possible, we want to use random samples because we know that they're representative of the population. Let's look at a couple quick examples. I want to estimate the average age of a World Campus student. There are 100 students in my sections of Stat 200. I ask them each how old they are, and I compute the average. In this case, I'm using a convenient sampling method. I have easy access to these students because they're in my sections of the course. They're probably not representative of the population of all World Campus students. For instance, almost all of my students will be undergraduate students, whereas the population is a mix of undergraduate and graduate students. Also, the students in my sections of the course may differ from the population in terms of their majors. This course is only required by certain majors. Let's look at another example. Now, again, I want to estimate the average age of a World Campus student. I go to the World Campus offices and ask for a list of all World Campus students. I use a random number generator to obtain a list of 100 students. I call those students, ask how old they are, and compute the average. This time, I'm using a simple random sampling method. Random number generators will randomly select cases from the population. When we do this, every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected, so it's a simple random sampling method. Next, we'll see this function in Minitab Express, where it's actually called sample from columns. In the online notes, you'll find videos that walk through all of the Minitab Express procedures covered in the course. There are Windows and Mac versions in the online notes. The Windows and Mac versions of Minitab Express are similar, but they're not always exactly the same. So in the online notes, there'll be videos for Windows users and videos for Mac users. For taking a simple random sample in Minitab Express, the directions are the same for Windows and Mac. You'll go to Data and Sample from Columns. I'll walk through one example with you here. Here I have a data set containing the names and populations of all of the towns in the state of Pennsylvania. Let's say that I want to take a simple random sample of 10 towns. I can go to Data, Sample from Columns. I'll double-click the column that contains the names of the towns, so C1, towns, because in my simple random sample, what I want is a list of 10 towns. Number of rows in each sample is going to be 10. The default method is to sample without replacement. This is what we're going to be using in this course. It means that within each sample, the same town can only appear once. Note, though, that if you take multiple samples, the same town could appear in more than one of those samples. So sampling without replacement only applies within each sample. The base for random number generator, we're always going to be leaving blank. When we click OK, we now have a new column on the right that contains the names of 10 randomly selected towns. If you're using a Mac, you can find an example of doing this in the Mac version of Minitab Express in the online notes. Now let's go back to the PowerPoint slides. Our 8th learning objective is to identify potential non-response and response bias. In addition to considering sampling bias, which we can avoid by using the simple random sampling method that we just saw, you also need to be able to identify non-response and response bias. These are both problems that should be prevented in the design of the research study. Non-response bias is the systematic favoring of certain outcomes that occurs when the individuals who choose to participate in a study differ from the individuals who choose not to participate. Response bias is the systematic favoring of certain outcomes that occurs when participants do not respond truthfully. They may do so to align with social norms or to appease the researcher. Let's look at an example. A researcher sets up a table in a grocery store and asks customers if they would like to participate in a taste test study of soy milk. Are non-response and/or response bias a potential issue here? First, let's consider non-response bias. Non-response bias occurs when the people who choose to participate differ from those who choose not to participate. In this case, the people who choose to participate may be more likely to be vegans or lactose intolerant. In other words, people who would drink soy milk regularly. Therefore, non-response bias is a potential problem. Now let's consider response bias. Response bias occurs when participants are not honest with their responses. In this case, we may need more information. If the researcher is interviewing participants, they may not feel comfortable saying negative things about the soy milk to his face. If the participants are completing an anonymous survey, on the other hand, they may be more likely to tell the truth. For this scenario, I would say that this is a maybe. When it comes to answering these questions on the lab assignments, know that the most important part of your answer is your argument. You'll always be asked to explain why. Here, I think you could argue for or against response bias, depending on how you view the question. On the quiz and exams, questions will be more specific. For example, they may say that participants were uncomfortable and were not answering honestly, in which case response bias was clearly an issue. One thing that students sometimes get tripped up with is that individual differences do not equal bias. If people are giving different answers because they actually have different opinions, that is not response bias. Those are true individual differences. We're going to shift our focus a bit now. Our remaining learning objectives all relate to the design of research studies. Here, we'll distinguish between experimental and observational designs. In an experimental study, the researcher manipulates the treatments received by the subjects and collects data. This is also known as a scientific study. In an observational study, the researcher collects data without performing any manipulations. This is also known as a non-experimental study. Here's an example. We have a research question. Is there a relationship between eating broccoli and strength? In the first study, a sample of 50 adults is obtained, the amount of broccoli that they've eaten in the last month is recorded, and the weight that they can bench press is recorded. In this study, the researchers are not making any manipulations. They're recording how much broccoli the participants have eaten on their own. This is an observational study. In a second study, a sample of 50 adults is obtained. Half of the participants are told not to eat any broccoli for the next month, and the other half are told to eat at least one serving of broccoli every day for the next month. At the end of the month, the weight that they can bench press is recorded. Here, the researchers are manipulating the broccoli that each participant is eating. This is an experimental study. Experimental studies are typically preferred over observational studies because they allow for more control. A common problem with observational studies is that there may be other variables influencing the results that the researchers did not take into account, which are known as confounding variables, and they're the focus of our next learning objective. For example, in the first broccoli study here, participants who are more health conscious or who are actively trying to gain muscle may already be eating more broccoli than those who are less conscious or who are not actively trying to gain muscle. In this case, we would say that health consciousness or actively trying to gain muscle are confounding variables. This leads us to our 10th learning objective, identifying confounding variables. By definition, a confounding variable is a characteristic that varies between cases and is related to other variables in a study, also known as a lurking variable or third variable. Here's a classic example. There's a relationship between ice cream sales and home invasions. In months when ice cream sales are high, the number of home invasions also tends to be high. This is based on observational data, and there's a confounding variable at play here, and that is temperature. When it's warmer outside, people tend to eat more ice cream, and there tends to be more home invasions, probably for a number of reasons, including folks going out of town on a vacation. Next, we'll see how we can avoid confounding variables by using a randomized experiment. In order to control for confounding variables, participants can be randomly assigned to different levels of the explanatory variable. This is known as randomization. An experiment that involves randomization may be referred to as a randomized experiment or randomized comparative experiment. Note that randomization and random sampling are different concepts. Randomization refers to the random assignment of experimental units to different conditions. Random sampling refers to the probability-based method for selecting a sample from a population that we saw earlier in this lesson. To determine when causal conclusions, as opposed to associations, can be made, we need to look at the design of the research study. If we're making a causal conclusion, we're saying that changes in one variable can be attributed to changes in a second variable. This is different from an association, which is a relationship between variables. Randomization is necessary to make a causal conclusion. The logic behind this is that when we're randomly assigning cases to different treatments, the groups that we end up with should not be biased in terms of any confounding variables. In other words, the confounding variables will be evenly spread across all of those levels of the explanatory variable. We're almost done. This is the 13th of 14 learning objectives. The 13th learning objective is to classify samples as being independent or paired. In both observational and experimental studies, we often want to compare two or more groups. When comparing two or more groups, the cases in those groups can be independent of one another, or they can be paired with one another. In independent groups, cases in each group are unrelated to one another. In paired groups, cases in each group are in some way matched with one another, also known as dependent samples or matched pairs. Let's look at some examples. We have a research question. Do fourth graders score better on a reading comprehension test than third graders? In one study, a sample of third and fourth graders is obtained. All children take the reading comprehension test. In this case, the children in the two groups are not matched or paired in any way. These are two independent groups. In a second study, a sample of third graders is obtained. They each take the test. We wait a year until they're in fourth grade, and they take the test again. Now we have data from each child when they're in third grade and again when they're in fourth grade. These are paired groups. Our data are paired by child. When we're working with paired data, we'll often have two measures from the same person. For example, you'll see a lot of pre-test and post-test data. It is possible to have paired groups with different people. There's an example in the online notes that deals with data from husband and wife pairs, where data are paired by couple. We could also see brother-sister pairs. Our last learning objective is to identify control groups, placebos, and blinding in research studies and explain why each is used. The first two terms go together. A control group is a level of the explanatory variable that does not receive an active treatment. They may receive no treatment, or they may receive a placebo. They're used as the baseline to compare other treatment groups to. The placebo group is a group that receives what appears to be a treatment, but actually is neutral and does not contain any active treatment. In pharmaceutical research, they may be given a placebo pill, which is a sugar pill that doesn't contain any active medications. This is done to avoid a placebo effect, which is a psychological effect that occurs when someone thinks that they're being given a treatment, and then they perceive that they're feeling better. The last set of terms that we'll look at in this lesson are related to blinding. Blinding is a procedure employed in research to prevent bias in which the participants and/or the researchers interacting with the participants do not know which treatment each case is receiving. A study could be single-blind or double-blind. In a single-blind study, the participants do not know the treatment group that they've been assigned to. For example, in studies with a placebo group, researchers don't usually tell participants that they're being given a placebo pill. In a single-blind study, the researchers who are interacting directly with the participants would know what condition the participants are in. This could lead to some researcher bias. In those cases, a double-blind design could be used. In a double-blind study, participants and the researchers working directly with them do not know who has been assigned to which condition. In this lesson, you learned about how research studies are designed and how data are collected. Much of the vocabulary introduced in this lesson will be used throughout the course. Because this lesson has a lot of vocabulary terms, you should consider making flashcards for this lesson. This is the only lesson that I would ever recommend making flashcards for, because after this week we'll be focusing more on procedures and interpretation. If you need additional examples, there are different examples in the online notes. If you have any questions, you should post them to the Lesson 1 discussion board in your section of Canvas.